So my talk today is entitled The Marian Reforms Without Marius. And I very much enjoyed the flyer that Jeremy circulated, which featured an academic painting of Marius brooding and then excised Marius, leaving only an empty space. But I also thought that this slide might make a pretty good metaphor for the basic argument of the talk. This is the so-called Marius on display at Munich. And I would guess that chances are anyone who's done any Roman or Republican Roman history has probably seen this image and seen it identified as Marius, whether it's an undergraduate lecture or a book or something. The thing is, this is this is not Marius. We feel the need to put Marius, to label Marius, even if it's not. And the reason we know that it's probably not Marius. 19th and 20th century art historians just like trying to slap oftentimes specious labels on Republican era portraiture. But one reason that we suspect that it's not Marius, and this is based on the conclusion of Corarelli, is there is some evidence to suggest that this particular portrait came from the south of Rome on the Appian Way, from around the tomb of the Scipios, and probably the most plausible identification is that it's Lucius Cornelius Scipio, the brother of Scipio Africanus, consul in his own right, victor at the Battle of Magnesia. So this is not Marius, and yet chances are you've seen at some point this bust on a PowerPoint slide or in a book labeled as Marius incorrectly, as it was for a very long time in Munich. And the need to put the label of Marius on things, a statue bust, or, and as I'll be talking today, an army reform or a series of army reforms, I think deceives us. In part because it causes us to misunderstand how military reform actually works during the Roman Republic. The idea that there's a single actor, a single authority, Gaius Marius, who's calling all the shots, and therefore is personally responsible for a series of changes. One thing that I think is really important to remember, and I think it's almost easy to forget given the assumptions that we have about how, say, Western militaries work, there is no commander-in-chief in the Roman Republic. There is no one person who is the end authority for all Roman armies. The Roman legions are all assigned to different commanders with imperium who are bounded by their own individual provinces. And so therefore, even a very powerful magistrate like a consul only commands his army in his province. And this makes it very difficult for one individual to therefore initiate any kind of army-wide reform, because there's simply no individual who commands all Roman armies. So Gaius Marius obviously is a very important military figure in the late Republic. He holds consular imperium in one form or another continuously for a good 8 years, from 107 down to 100 BC, 2 years as proconsul in Africa, then his 6 consulships, 107 and then 104 down to 100. That's obviously a very long time for any one Roman to be in command, and that does make Marius an exceptional figure. But we again have to remember he only commands a fraction of Rome's total armies, probably 2 legions in Numidia and maybe 3, although it's not clear, against the Cimbrian Teutones. And during this time, Rome, also not totally clear, but Rome probably has anywhere between 9 and 11 legions. So what that means is Marius only commands maybe a third at most of all active Roman soldiers. And when you only command at most a third of all Roman soldiers, it's very, very hard to institute an army-wide reform. And that's why I actually feel when we talk about the idea of Marian reforms, it causes us to misunderstand the structure of the Roman army and the structure of Roman command. Incidentally, I suspect that one reason why the most concentrated series of Roman military reforms ultimately takes place in the early empire, under Augustus mostly, is because this is truly the first time that Rome actually has a single commander-in-chief, the Roman emperor, who now can truly produce army-wide policy. The other thing that I think we want to consider when we sort of take Marius out of the Marian reforms is what our sources actually tell us about the individual reforms. Our sources, no source really suggests that Marius is engaging in a massive overhaul of the Roman army. Rather, they assign kind of small reforms to him here and there. No one source really assigns all the reforms that are attributed to him. And so what has happened is modern scholars have, as oftentimes we have to do, have taken these sort of individual references to a reform here and there assigned to Marius and have kind of welded them into the so-called, the concept, the discourse of the Marian reforms, making the overall set of reforms somehow greater than the sum of the parts. So what I thought I would just sort of do is let's look at the kind of traditional scholarly construct of the Marian reforms, what they involve, and then let's actually look what our sources say, kind of arguing that each reform really is quite modest and maybe even in many instances inconsequential. So the sort of standard view, the view that you might receive in an undergraduate lecture of the Marian reforms, is that they involve the recruitment of impoverished proletarii into Roman armies, the professionalization of Roman soldiers by forcing them to be Marius's mules, carrying their baggage everywhere rather than having mules or actual mules or attendants to do so. The primacy of the aquila, the eagle standard, which oftentimes is linked to tactical reforms, perhaps the dominance of the cohort, and then some kind of modification to the Roman throwing javelin, the pilum. So let's go and look at these kind of one by one. The most significant reform is always described as the recruitment of the proletarii. And the idea is that this change to the recruitment patterns of the Roman army is so critical because the proletarii are these greedy, impoverished men who have nothing. In fact, even Sallust says this. And therefore, they are more bound to their commander who can provide them with pay, with loot, and eventually with land. And the idea is that these basically mercenary poor guys will become the sort of raw material for the subsequent civil wars. Now, without question, when you look at Roman soldiers in any period of civil war, whether it's the 80s or the 40s or the 30s, they do come across as extremely greedy and mercenary and kind of what's in it for me. Although I suspect that a lot of this has to do with the simple fact that there's a complete breakdown of political legitimacy during these periods. And so therefore you might expect soldiers everywhere to be sort of trying to get what they can. That being said, I think we should stress that Marius's recruitment of the proletarii is both quite traditional and also relatively modest. So here we just have the passage of Sallust, where Marius is recruiting volunteers that he's going to take with him to Africa. But we also know that proletarii have traditionally been recruited into Roman Republican armies during moments of military crisis. So for example, we have a passage of Ennius, the great early 2nd century epic poet, who celebrates a moment oftentimes assigned to the Pyrrhic Wars, when the proletarius was equipped with shield and savage sword at public cost, and they therefore guarded the walls of Rome, the city, and the forum. So this doesn't seem to be a problem for Ennius, who celebrates it, and again, a fragment that we have of him, and also suggests that this has been going on for quite a long time, recruiting proletarii into armies when you need them. And proletarii had always served in Roman fleets, so they had always been a military resource, and this had never been particularly problematic. The other thing is, does Marius actually use the proletarii that he takes with them as some kind of personal army, men loyal only to him, dependent on him for pay and loot and land? Well, for one thing, it's unclear he actually takes all that many. I mean, one thing we have to remember is Marius is not recruiting an entire army from scratch. He's going to go over to Numidia, where he's been assigned kind of through some political shenanigans as the new consular governor of that province. Therefore, he's going to take over the legions of Caecilius Metellus. So what he's recruiting is a supplementum, a reinforcement that is going to, excuse me. For some reason, I find I lose my voice when I talk into Zoom and nowhere else. So he's recruiting a supplementum, a reinforcement that is going to bring the legions up to strength, and probably also allow him to discharge men who are sick, injured, just been serving for too long. We don't get the size of the supplementum that Marius takes with him, but throughout much of the Roman Republic, it had been pretty standard that for a consular army, a supplementum would consist of 5,000 citizen troops and usually more from the allies, usually around 7,500. That's actually a number that comes up again and again in Livy, describing the reinforcements that go overseas, although those numbers can vary. So if it's 5,000, that's not a huge number of people for an army that overall will consist of over probably 20,000 men. And no, not all of them are proletarii. Sallust says that many of them are, maybe even most of them. But if it's a 5,000 man supplementum and there's 3,000 proletarii and 2,000 kind of traditional assidui, that's not a huge private personal army of greedy mercenary poor people. They would only represent a fraction of the total army that Marius commands in Numidia. Furthermore, does Marius actually keep these guys with him as some kind of personal army, private army, bodyguard? The answer is no. He comes back from Numidia in 105. And he now is re-elected consul, is given a new command against the Cimbrian Teutones. And what does he do? He discharges his Numidian legions. We're told this by Frontinus, which would mean away with all those proletarii. And then he takes up the traditionally levied legions of Rutilius Rufus, his fellow military reformer and fierce political rival. But he thinks these legions are somehow in better fighting shape. It seems that most of the proletarii go home. It's possible that some still tag along as reinforcements or to fill out the force. But those troops, by and large, do not come with him. So if this is an expedient due to, in some ways, the military emergency of the late 2nd century, when the Cimbri are wiping out army after army and the war in Numidia isn't going well, it's certainly a short-term expedient, at least for Marius. And incidentally, we don't necessarily have a lot of evidence that proletarii are heavily used one way or the other afterwards. Other than we know that the Roman property requirement at this point is quite low. Even an assiduous who's worth 375 sesterces is eligible to serve in the legions. And of course, the subsequent failure of the Roman census. There's only one census in 70 between the Social War and the Civil Wars. In 70 BC might also mean that actually people aren't necessarily registered particularly accurately. But that said, it's unclear that this is actually anything other than a single short-term expedient. Incidentally, the person who's written a whole book on this is not me. It's François Cadieu L'Armée Imaginaire. I'm probably mispronouncing that, but he has written a whole monograph essentially arguing that the proletarian army is a mirage, and that this aspect of the Marian reform doesn't really amount to much. All right, so let's move on. The other thing that, or another thing that is assigned to Marius, is the idea that he turns his troops into Marius's mules. And again, certainly this happens. Our sources describe his actions, but this is then kind of blown up to say, oh no, he's not just marching his guys hard and making them carry their own stuff, but this is creating a professional army of tough, well-disciplined soldiers, and this is kind of the start. This is the start of the Roman professional army that will, subsequently becoming the army of Caesar and Augustus, and so on and so forth. Again, our source is pretty clear that Marius is tough on his troops. That being said, this is also pretty standard stuff. This isn't unique to Marius. This is something that we have repeated descriptions of previous Republican era commanders doing. You take over an army that's slack, that needs toughening up and that needs discipline, and so you take various steps to make their lives miserable in the hope of making them better soldiers. So Scipio Aemilianus, under whom Marius served in Spain, had done this when he comes and takes over the troops in Numidia. And this involves taking away kind of luxuries from the soldiers, forcing them to march with only essentials. I'm not going to linger on this passage for too long, but again, it's the kind of new commander toughens up the troops. And also, this is what Caecilius Metellus, the guy that Marius replaces in Numidia, had also done, forcing his troops to undertake tough marches as a way of training, of toughing them up, of getting them disciplined. So Marius's mules basically falls into this pattern of behavior, probably expected behavior of what a good Republican commander does, taking command of a lax army. It probably doesn't point to any kind of permanent change other than whipping your troops into shape. So I wouldn't necessarily suggest that Marius's mules, is indicative of any new professionalism in the Roman army. I'll come back to the professionalism maybe at the end, but if anything, it actually suggests that these guys are kind of amateurs, right? That they need to get, kicked in the bottom in order to actually get them up to fighting trim. All right, so we're moving through down the kind of list. Let's go to the eagle. And again, this comes from a passage, again, a somewhat problematic passage in Pliny the Elder, who's describing the totems used by the Roman legions prior to Marius. And essentially the passage suggests that there are 4 totems: the Minotaur, the horse, the wild boar, and the wolf, and that these totems are carried in front of individual units, ordines, and there's some, I think, uncertainty about what Pliny actually means by that, and that Marius says, well, to hell with those, we're just going to use a totem that already is being used, the eagle, as the primary and dominant totem of the legion. The rest, he doesn't even leave in camp, he just sweeps them away. So what's going on here? I mean, a kind of standard explanation, and one that perfectly well fits the language of the passage, is that somehow these other totems are assigned to different parts of the manipular legion, presumably the light infantry and then the 3 lines of heavy infantry, although, I don't know, maybe the horse belongs to the cavalry, and that these are getting swept away as Marius retools his legions as cohortal legions, and therefore they just need the eagle as this kind of single solitary emblem. My biggest concern with that is that we know that many of the ranks of the old manipular legion didn't have standards at all. The Welites certainly don't, because they don't assign, they have no units or standard bearers. That's what Polybius tells us. It's unclear if the cavalry do. So it's unclear that we actually need all of those totems for the different parts and pieces of the manipular legion. One thing that I think is quite possible, and this would be, I'm actually kind of following a hypothesis that's been put forth by Nicholas Secunda, is that these other 4 totems aren't necessarily the pieces of the manipular legion, but actually each totem represents one of the 4 consular legions that are raised every year. And one thing that I like about this explanation is that it would explain why Marius does this in his second consulship, that is after he's come back from Numidia and is going off to fight the Cimbrian Teutones. If these old totems are kind of the legacy symbols of the consular legions, it would mean that they kind of swap around as consular, as legions get transferred, as sometimes a consular legion becomes a Praetorian legion or gets disbanded, which might be why the eagle is kind of become the kind of already sort of prime symbol anyway. Polybius suggests that already it's used before Marius. But in the second consulship, we know from Frontinus that Marius is coming back. He's swapping out the old legions he's had with him in Numidia. He's taking up new legions that were used by the old consul. And if there was some kind of traditional shuffle of these consular totems, Marius might have just said, that's silly. Let's just use the eagle that everyone's already using anyway. That might explain why we see this, that Pliny specifically assigns this to Marius's second consulship in 104 BC. Now, I think either way, I would suggest that Pliny himself makes this a relatively minor and modest reform, and probably isn't far-reaching. It's also notable that while Marius supposedly excises a number of totems being used in some way by the legion, legions keep using other totems other than the eagle. I mean, it is true that the eagle will gain primacy in the late Republic and early Empire to the point that it's given cult by the legions, to the point that Augustus will go to great lengths to recover eagles that are lost. But throughout this, legions have other totems that they clearly like and cherish that are unique to the legion. So boar, I think that's the wolf. If you look in these guys' helmets, they've got a little dolphin or a fish right here. If Marius does do away with some other totems, the totems come back. It's certainly not a far-reaching reform, even if Marius does impose it on the legions that he commands. Here's some more zodiac symbols. All right, so moving on. Marius then supposedly makes some kind of modification to the pilum. And we're told that what he does is the Roman heavy pilum. These are reconstructions, obviously, that I'm showing you, but you can see, and let me fire up my laser pointer again. You can see that the shaft, the iron shaft of the pilum attaches to the wooden haft by these rivets, usually 2. And we're told that, that Marius has the brilliant idea of replacing one of these rivets, which are usually metal, with a wooden rivet, with a wooden just kind of dowel. And this will, seems cause either hopefully cause the shaft to break so it can't be pulled out and thrown back, and maybe somehow get more lodged in the shield of the opponent. Now, this is actually something where we have a good number of pilum from before Marius and even more from after Marius. And what we can say is nowhere do we see the pilum missing 2 rivets. I mean, there's no evidence of single riveted pilum or that the rivets left out to make room for a wooden plug. So if Marius did indeed have this idea, it doesn't seem to have stuck. It doesn't seem to have made the pilum better or improved the pilum in the long run. And I would say that if Marius did this, it might be akin to what, when I was in the American Army, we used to call the good idea fairy. The good idea fairy is when a commander gets bitten by the good idea fairy and thinks they've got a brilliant idea that's going to change everything and get them some kind of big promotion or award, and the actual idea is kind of stupid and unworkable. I would suggest that the modification of the pilum is Marius getting nipped by the good idea fairy, and it probably doesn't stick. All right, yeah, here's just some images of Roman pilum. This is from Bishop and Colston. As you can see, all the rivets are there. All right. So what I thought I would do is, so let's go. So I want to kind of actually move on from just sort of arguing against the concept of the Marian Legion, or arguing that to teach the concept of the Marian Legion or some kind of discrete military reforms that take place from 107 to 100 BC is not really useful, and kind of leads to a misunderstanding not only of Roman military history, but in some ways of Roman history more broadly. I mean, you will read books and people will say, well, you know, after the Marian reforms, you know, this or that, and it's unclear that we should be talking about that at all. So how can that being said, we do know that there is change, that the Roman army undergoes tactical changes, and that it looks very different as described by Polybius, who's writing in the year 150 and probably actually describing the army as it appears in his sources for the Second Punic War. And that is very, very different from the army that we have in Julius Caesar, who's describing firsthand his army in operation in Gaul. So I'm not arguing for some kind of static Roman army or an army that doesn't change, which incidentally, some people who don't like the Marian reforms do. And here I think Francois Caudieu, it's a good book, but he tends to see a kind of static Roman army, a Roman army that hasn't changed at all. There are clearly, I think there are some big things that are different. The cavalry has gone away. The Velites, the light infantry, have gone away. I suspect that these are probably gradual things. No source suggests that Marius banishes the Roman cavalry or that Marius banishes the Velites. It probably happens over time. Let's actually talk about one thing that is clearly different, that Polybius describes the legion that deploys in maniples, based around a company of 120 men that array in this kind of quincux pattern. And by the time we get to Caesar, the Roman legion fights like this in cohorts, with the main tactical unit being a cohort of a battalion of 3 maniples that have been lumped together. Technically probably a paper strength of around 480. And they kind of deploy like this with 4 cohorts to the front. At least that's how Caesar likes to fight, and then the other 6 in 3-3-3. So still a triplex Achaeus, but now three layers of cohorts. Now, on one hand, there's a classic paper by Bell that pointed out that cohorts turn up well before the Marian reforms, and basically made a case really well before this talk of a Marian reform without Marius, of that this process is taking place. Marius has very little to do with it. We see cohorts being used in Spain, as it seems, as cohorts already in the 2nd century BC. And so there you kind of have an argument for some kind of a gradual evolution from a manipular legion to a cohortal legion. That being said, if we want to look for a real moment of discontinuity in the Roman army, I would suggest that it's not Marius, or it's not his main period of military activity from 107 to 100. It's actually the social war. This is the moment when all of the Italian wings become Roman legions. And I think this must radically transform how the Roman army works and fights, and probably also coalesces maybe some gradual developments, kind of like Hemingway's Bankruptcy. Things go from gradually to suddenly with the social war. And I actually want to use the cohortal legion to kind of think about that problem, in that we know that before the social war, when a Roman army is marching around and it expects to encounter the enemy, it puts its Italians first. Roughly, Polybius tells us, 1/5 to 1/4 of the Italian wing is chosen to be the extraordinarii. And they're the vanguard of the Roman army. They march out first. And therefore, they're the ones who are most likely to encounter the enemy first, and who are also most likely to start forming up for battle first. And so we have the extraordinary, they're marching around. One thing that's also important to note about the cohort, the cohort is initially not a tactical unit in the Roman army. It's a recruiting unit that the Romans use to get troops from their Italian allies, that they will go to an Italian community and say, you need to provide us with a cohort, or probably in some instances, several cohorts. A cohort seems to be a particularly appropriate sized unit to call from a single Latin colony, 480 guys in a cohort, 3,000 to 5,000 guys in a Latin colony. And we know that local Italian leaders serve as cohort commanders. That is, these cohorts are commanded by, in some instances, the local magistrate of this Italian community. So the Italians are recruited in cohorts. Initially, however, it seems they fight in maniples. At least Polybius describes the Italians fighting in maniples in the 150s. But when you actually are thinking about, if you're the vanguard of a Roman army and you're deployed in your maniples and you're going to form up in maniples, this actually is a little problematic, because if you're the first 4 cohorts, you're marching along, you see the enemy is there, you're going to have to do this kind of slow turn to start forming up to form say the right flank of that Roman army as all the rest of the army kind of comes behind you. That means that you actually aren't forming up all that much of a frontage all that quickly. Now, the Romans can get away with this kind of slow turn as long as they have a lot of velites, as long as they have a lot of light infantry, because those velites can go and hold ground and create the kind of space for the ponderous turn of an army to get into position. And so this is where maybe some of the changes that are gradual start to become a little interlocking. What happens when the velites go away? I'm not going to get into right now why we think the velites go away, or why I think the velites go away, but they do seem to be suddenly absent in Caesar. Well, if you don't have any velites to kind of hold that ground and buy you space and time to really get into position, what you might all of a sudden do if you are the extraordinary, if you're the vanguard of the army, is really quickly try to throw up a legion-sized frontage by having all of your cohorts quickly go to the front. So here I have some Italian extraordinary very quickly throwing up a 4 cohort front against an imaginary enemy. And the reason that I'm doing that is that all of a sudden gives us basically the kind of legion that we see Caesar deploying: 4 cohorts in the front, 3 and 3. And so what I would argue, and this is admittedly a hypothesis, but that one way we get the cohortal legion, yes, there's some gradual change, but it's that this is how Italian wings start forming up. Rather than forming up by maniples, they start forming up by the cohorts they're recruited with to begin with. This is particularly important for that Italian wing that's in the van. And then after the social war, every legion becomes every allied wing becomes a legion. And so legions start fighting like their Italian counterparts. And so on one hand, it's kind of the view from Italy, as I've argued, but it also suggests that the social war is the really big moment of discontinuity. And indeed, one other thing that is, I think, provides us with a discontinuity, and I want to wrap up in just a second so I can open up for your questions, is Roman military deployments before the social war are quite modest. Just following Brunt, the number of legions deployed really before the Civil War, with the end of the Cimbrian Teutones invasion and then before the social war, it's like 3 to 6. So there's not a lot of Roman soldiers gaining experience in the 90s BC. And then the social war happens, massive mobilization to fight the social war. And then between civil wars of Marius and Sulla and a basically really high level of Roman military involvement, the first century BC sees just very, very heavy military mobilizations, 13 to 41 legions. That would be the equivalent of roughly 7 to 20 legions before the social war. But the number of Roman soldiers deployed goes way, way up. And when we think about, the kind of argument is, well, how does the Roman army professionalize? It does seem to be professionalizing in Caesar. His troops seem much, much more professional than, say, some of these guys in Livy. But I think the professionalization probably has nothing to do with Marius. It just has to do with the fact that in the post-social war mobilizations, There are so many more soldiers under arms. One way that you're achieving those numbers is keeping some of them under arms longer. Many of Caesar's soldiers seem to be serving continuously from when he goes off to his province until, say, the Battle of Pharsalus. That's going to give them a lot of experience, which is going to make them more professional than, say, some of the more amateurish legions of the 3rd and 2nd century had appeared. So at any rate, I think that's how we get tactical change, tactical reform without Marius. But with that, I'm going to end my formal presentation and see if anyone has questions.